Good evening. I'd like to call to order the work session for the Watertown City Council of Monday, August 21st, 2017. First item on the agenda is to introduce Colin. Shane?
Thank you, Mayor. I would like everybody to meet Colin Paulson. He's a Watertown native. Unfortunately, he went to UND college, but I won't hold that against him. But no, I seriously want to welcome him to our staff, and we hope to utilize his expertise and actually assist him in growing in other skills as well, so that he can ultimately grow into hopefully my position someday if he chooses to stay around and nurture that possibility. And he's a very bright person, has a great personality as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I've really enjoyed it, the limited time that we have already spent together, and he's going to be a great asset. So with that, I guess if you want to ask him any questions, or if he wants to ask you any questions, I'll leave it at that.
Welcome, Colin.
Welcome.
Next item on the agenda is discussion of cost recovery fees associated with construction of 2nd Street Northwest. Shane?
Okay, thank you, Mayor. We've had a project coming down through the process of annexation and zoning, and now we're getting to the platting stage, and it is known as Valley View. It is 138 acres in total size for eventual build out, and it doesn't include this little corner piece of about 7 acres, but it does include the majority of the area that I've just outlined with the hand. The current phase 1 is 46 acres of that 138, and a portion of it abuts 2nd Street Northwest, which was improved in, I believe, a project in 2011, 2012, and then ultimately we've had a discussion previously in 2013 trying to outline how the cost recovery of the construction for 2nd Street Northwest would be accomplished, and that was done by staff and my predecessor, but nothing was ever completely finalized. The only portion of the project that was finalized is there's 4 lots of timberline addition right here, which we identified the assessment portion of that project for them, and subsequently they paid approximately, it's just under $50,000 for their improvements at that time. So where we're at now is in the plat that we'll bring forward and the subsequent development agreement, we try to identify costs that may exist out there for the developer and his team. And so far what we have is there's 500 and some feet fronting North 2nd Street here north of 16th Avenue. And then there's also a trunk sewer that was built in part of 2nd Street, and also another trunk sewer that goes along the western boundary of this. And so there's actually two different trunk sewer fees that could be applied to this property, and of course the assessment fee for the roadway. So where we're at is we're kind of at the point where I need to give you guys information and I need some feedback. And right now, this is just a brief summary of how the road costs in 2012. We billed Timberline $51.91 per foot of frontage at that time for their portion of 2nd Street. If we hold true to that formula, based on the frontage that the Valley View addition would have, that cost would be $27,351.90. Now, there's been another way of looking at these type of projects in the past, and that's by a cost recovery index, which we would compare the consumer price index based on 2012 and then compare it to the consumer price index of the current 2017. And we've done that. And so the rate per foot would go up to $55.23 if we applied that consumer rate or price index rate to the thing. That would bring the road assessment up to $29,101. As far as the assessment prices for trunk sewer, I'll switch into a different mode here. These items right here are what all of the sewer improvements that were done on 2nd Street Northwest when it was built. The summary of that is $27,313. $21,907 of that was assessed to the timberland portion of the project. So presumably the balance of that investment would be a potential cost to the developer as they connect, which is a very small portion of that project, but nonetheless is an unrecovered portion of that initial effort. Then the sewer that was put in along the western boundary of the Valley View addition, it serves, or would potentially serve, the Mack property, the Tesh property, which is still out in the county, hasn't been annexed, and it had a component for River Ridge as well. And so that there is an agreement out there that exists that we referenced, and what was previously Mack property, it identified that they would be responsible for 36.06% of the initial costs. Now the initial cost estimate was $150,000, which the agreement numbers then, that was all done pre-construction, would have been $54,090. However, the actual research on the cost of the trunk sewer came in much, much lower, so it was the actual cost that we arrived at was $76,965.54 as the as-built, which would then adjust that cost share down to $27,753.77. Now, we aren't applying the consumer price index to those figures, but mostly because there was an agreement that kind of already locked into dollar amounts. Now, that doesn't mean we can't at least talk about consumer price index on that, but with that, I guess I'll ask if you have questions, anything you want me to go back over, because I know I just spit out a lot of numbers to consider.
Who paid for the trunk sewer in 1997?
It was solely on High Plains.
So is that $27,000 a payment that would go to High Plains that we would collect and give to High Plains?
I'm not sure exactly how you'd want to go about it, but it would go back to them. Yeah.
Well, we have the agreement up here. We'll see who that's between and who it would go to.
That's the west?
Right. There's
line?
a trunk sewer that goes along the west side of the property that was primarily extended to service the High Plains development, which River Ridge, and they did do some an agreement along with that project.
So this is the initial agreement where it is stating all of the percentages and the preliminary construction cost, and then basically in there it is saying that it'll be completely constructed by High Plains, and I'm not sure if they spelled out how that money would be recovered.
Does the developer know about this agreement
I'm not sure if
and these
we've
dollar amounts?
explicitly explained that to him, but we did warn him that there was likely to be sewer connection fees.
So here is what I would assume High Plains attorney sent the city for cost recovery.
So this city had a percentage amount as well, right?
Yep.
Can you go back up to that where it showed the breakout of percentage of who? I thought Tesh's name was on there too.
Yep. Do you want percentages
Oh, that's
or price?
not percentage.
Okay, here's percentage.
Oh, okay. I see. So, and these are due upon connection?
Mhm. There was another provision in there too that said that if he were to connect on the south side, or if development were to happen on the south side or the north side, it would just be 50% if he was connecting to one side. So like how he's developing from the south, so it would just be 50% up front for
And then
connection onto the
50% the next time?
Yep.
And did the city pay High Plains, the city's percentage, back in 97 or whenever this was?
Yeah, I think that was showing a receipt of payment.
Oh,
Looks like
Yeah.
we coded that.
right. Okay.
So that second line, that west trunk sewer, was put in to initially service the Hofteaser addition. Is High Plains, is that the Hofteasers?
Yes.
Okay. But it was, I'm assuming, sized to accommodate the development in between?
Yes,
So to the south?
it was. I know that for a fact.
Okay. And there is or is not any definition of cost recovery in there in regards to when and how? Is that something that,
That's in this agreement.
Yep.
They describe paying at connection and the percentage.
and that percentage, those dollars goes back to High Plains?
Yes.
Okay, so is that our obligation to collect that, or is that High Plains?
Good question. The city signed our portion and we paid our portion. So I would assume that would be collectible by High Plains, but we would probably have to have in our development agreement that all obligations are covered.
Right,
Yeah.
we'd have to notify them of the connection and so that they could
Right.
work the collection part of it.
Correct.
So since there's a plat being proposed, this is going to be a condition of plat approval that the development agreement be executed and the cost recovery elements be included in that development agreement. Like any plat has responsibilities of the person platting that they'll have to cover. So Shane's going to be writing the development agreement to go with the plat, and this would be one of the conditions, so that they pay this, they pay the Second Street cost, and whatever the other standard conditions. They do the internal streets, and they dedicate park, and they do all the stuff that's required by ordinance.
Correct. So primarily I'm looking for direction on how we handle the cost share of North Second Street. Do we just do the straight dollar amount, or do we apply the cost, the consumer price index factor to it? That's really kind of boiling down to where one of the simple decisions that I would like to get some direction.
And that would be for
The
their
cost
pro
recovery.
rata share linear footage rate
Correct.
plus the connection, the sewer trunk connection that heads off to the west from Second.
Correct.
Okay.
Is that included in the 27,351.90?
No,
That's just road.
yep.
And the sewer was another
$5,400.
$5,400.
Shane, wouldn't you normally have an inflation index? I mean, you deal with this every once in a while, I'm guessing, don't you? I mean, what's your normal procedure?
Yes, this is a little bit different. In fact, the only reason I say it's different is because we built a concrete road versus an asphalt road. We built a little bit wider road than usual because it's a collector. So 90% of the time, we don't have this discussion because the developer is the one that's actually building the road. In this case, the road got improved multiple times already in its history. In fact, the roadway was a gravel county road that got improved to a asphalt road that quickly fell apart and then was reconstructed and then was falling apart again and was facing a second reconstruction when this project came forward. So that's part of the reason that the High Plains developer has not been included in a cost recovery for this project, is because they've already presumably paid for two roadways that, albeit fell apart prematurely, shouldn't have fell apart this soon. And but they've already paid some investment in this. So the way this would stand is that all of the space between timberland and, well, I'll take that back. All the space between 14th Avenue and 20th Avenue that hasn't already been associated with development would be paying their pro rata share based on whatever we decide to pursue. And that's, I'm just simply asking that do we recover our costs at the time of 2012, the 5191, or do we want to put a consumer price index factor on it? And I think the inflationary factor is fine. However, the developer probably would argue that the costs of, we were in an inflationary mode back in 2011, 2012, which maybe doesn't exist today. I can't tell you that for face value because I didn't work here in town. I don't know what the price of asphalt was. I don't know what the price of concrete was in 2012. I don't have that history, but so with that, I guess it's.
I can answer that. The history here is that we don't normally have extended payback times. Up until the Eastwoods property acquisition, which we collect on a pro rata share for developers tributary to it, that's the only project where we've applied an inflationary factor. But that's also the most recent cost recovery project. This would be the next one. And this one, it's up to you now if you want to continue that practice. There's not very much inflation from when this was built, but the next phase could be in 2 years, could be in 20 years. If it's in 2 years, it won't be much different, but if it's in 20 years, yeah, it's going to be quite a bit different. So our most recent practice has been to apply inflation to our cost for the recovery. But that's up to you.
Well, on this one, we have, it's not exactly like this, but where the city has fronted some of these costs, we have had agreements that have had either a hard and fast number attached, or we've had a percentage of interest to be applied annually, which, any one of these, at any point could get done. It would seem to me, based on the Eastwoods tributary practice and what I would call recent history where we have charged interest rates on an annual basis, it would appear to me like we should go to the 5191 linear footage cost that was applied back in, was that 12, did you say? 2012? And I think we should apply the CPI at that point. It seems like it's in line with what we have been doing, and it would appear like that's what we probably should do here. Now, if the gentleman that has this, could he pay this all out at one time and pay ahead so that if he so chooses, just to get it done and out of the way so that there aren't any, that way they have a known cost versus 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. Is that an option?
I would think it would be. And I was going to caution you on the other aspect of that. I'm not going to say that the way we did things in Marshall, Minnesota is equal to what we strive to do things in Watertown. But we did one prior to my coming to Watertown, but there was one that was a 5-acre plot of land that did a deferred assessment and had an interest rate applied to it annually. And that assessment rose to in excess of $20,000. It started out about $7,000 or $8,000, and by the time somebody was ready to buy it and invest in it, had risen to over $20,000. So we have to be conscious of that time factor does have a significant impact on these recovery efforts.
Well, and that's why I was wondering.
So it almost makes the property undevelopable if that ticket price gets too high. So we have to be conscious of that
Right.
at least.
And that's why I was saying, if they so chose,
Yeah.
and they wanted to buy it out, get it done with,
Our
I'm assuming we
standard-
would do that.
Our standard assessment project, this is not an assessment project. This is a cost recovery, which is different. But we do assessment projects every year, alleys and streets, and those do have an interest rate. And they don't have an indefinite amount of time to pay those off. And Shelley, correct me if I'm wrong, I think, is it 10 years max? And the interest rate used to always be 10%. And we've recently, on at least one project, reduced that interest rate on an assessment project down to 3%, or 4%, somewhat arbitrary. But the Consumer Price Index is a federally determined number that anyone can look up and see. It's based on actual costs at the time compared. So it's not arbitrary in any sense. It's the actual inflation of the dollar.
Shane, has there been a because this was oversized, is there an allocation of this that isn't either Timberlands or the developers that we're talking about now? Is there some percentage of that shouldn't be in there?
Okay, right. Okay, the bottom of this table does summarize some credits. So they had
Quite a bit of credit.
yeah. So they had a credit for existing pavement width of 507,000. They had a cost for upsizing from local to collector road of 33,000, and they had a cost associated with the roadway widening. So they did factor this in. I mean, it changed the rate per foot between 58.13 to 51.91. So
Okay, so it's already built into these numbers. Okay, good. Anyway, that's my recommendation. I think we should. It mirrors most closely what we've been doing, albeit on a sparse basis because it doesn't happen all that often. But it does seem to be in line with what we have done, and it seems probably more reasonable go to the CPI than it would be a fixed dollar amount or a fixed percentage amount. My recommendation.
I don't disagree with that, but is that dropping down to the 27,753, 77? Is that number fixed, or should we be talking about an inflationary adjustment? I mean, that goes back 20 years, right?
right, and that's actually an agreement outside of the city. We didn't dictate those terms. That was
Okay, so we're not comparing apples to apples there when we start talking about inflationary.
no.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, if there's any agreement that we have that has all the terms spelled out, then those terms have to be met accordingly. In this particular case, we had the agreement that we had with Timberland, and really nothing that got formalized beyond that for the other ones. So to me, it would be most logical to go with the rate that was charged there, as I'd mentioned, and then move forward with the CPI calculations on that. And then certainly the trunk sewer that extends right on Second, they'd have to be a part of that too.
This is just for informational purposes. We do have assessment projects that have agreements that date back as far as 1970. So we have many, whole list of assessment projects from 1970 to current that have already agreements and parameters assigned to them for us to collect when activity happens along those routes. So there are many of them for us to track and keep track of, and we'll strive to do so the best that we can. But where we don't have set parameters, what we'll probably ask for some point going forward is that we set this procedure up, that if we're going to do a cost recovery, that we either tie it to this consumer price index or some other method, so that we don't have to come to you folks frequently to have this discussion. So this one kind of fell in between methods, and I just wanted some feedback before I put the development agreement together.
We have nothing documented, Shane, correct, then, in regards to what our guidelines or procedures are on this? Of how we take a look at this and what we should be doing?
We've been doing it on a project-by-project basis.
Okay, so we don't have anything that, to me it seems like it would certainly simplify things and be more consistent and more fair long-term if we documented our rhyme and reason and how we're going to do it, and then we follow that. Make sure it's manageable. That's probably my biggest concern is we have some of these things that we do. We got a lot of development, a lot of agreements. We got waivers of right to protest. We got a lot of these things, and it's always been a concern of mine that how do we track all these things and know?
Correct.
So that would be the same thing here. So
either that, or we need to follow traditional assessment procedures where it's locked in for at a set time frame, a set interest rate, and procedures that we collect through the tax roll would be the only other. We have to do it one or the other way, or both, actually. I mean, you could have two different systems set up, but assessments are once they're set, they're hands off. They just get collected.
Normally,
annually.
if this had been in the city limits, we would have done an assessment project, and then it's collected automatically with the taxes. But the reason this wasn't done as an assessment project is most of it was outside the city limits. And we can't assess outside the city limits.
And still is, for that matter.
So would that, if you did it that way and you got one person you're dealing with now, would it be their responsibility to make sure that as the individual lots are sold, that the appropriate assessment gets, their pro rata assessment amount goes to their?
Well, presumably what they do is they'll pay this fee, and they'll factor these costs into whatever market rate they get for their lots. So that doesn't trickle down to the individual lot owner as a small number. It's incorporated into their total cost of the lot.
Right, but if we're putting it on the assessment roll, that's tagged to a specific piece of property, right?
But our properties are big chunks now. They aren't subdivided into small pieces.
You're right, Mike. The answer is yes. I'm not sure what happens to an assessment when the land is subdivided, but I'm assuming they would have to somehow subdivide the assessment. The county would do that, I suppose.
If I bring in the 46 acres, Shane, and I make 100 lots and I start selling them off one by one, and the assessment was for on the 46 acres, let's just say that I have each one is an acre lot, right? I got 46 of them. 1/46 is going to, or some number is going to come off of that original assessment and get tagged to that specific property.
We have had assessment projects that subdivided, and we're calling them assessment projects. All that sewer list that Shane was referring to, those are really cost recovery projects. It's easy for us. We did lineal foot, and we don't care how much is in there. If they subdivide, it's still lineal foot. But when we do a true assessment project and it goes onto the tax roll for 10 years, if they subdivide before that 10 years is up, I don't know how they do that.
Usually they have to pay that off.
That
yeah,
amount.
before it's subdivided.
Before
That's
you
right.
subdivide,
Yeah,
it has
that's
to be paid
right.
off.
They have to pay it off.
The whole thing?
Yep, I think that's
Before they
true.
do any subdivision. Well, that would make
Yeah,
sense.
because
then.
one of the signatures on the plat is that all assessments have been paid.
Yep. Usually, that's all on the developers, usually what it does, and then they factor it into the cost of their lots when they put together. That's why some of the lots are cheaper. Usually they try to entice people to get into the original lots so that they can get some money flowing back to them. and then they get more expensive as they go down the road. But usually when you have assessments, they have to be paid before you can sell them to the next individual. So if it's $200,000, developer's paying that $200,000.
Well, my thing is, I would like to see, I think it should be something that we have a documented process or guideline in how we do this, so that
With staff would
as
dearly
staff
love
come and
that.
go, as council
It's really
people and
hard to
mayors
track
and
that.
whoever, it just seems like we've got to have a way of knowing how we track it, knowing how we do it, and that's the way we're going to do it. So,
Shane, as long as you're in the hot seat there and we're talking about Valley View, can you give us a brief overview, and I stress brief on this, based upon the last Planning Commission meeting, what is going to be coming before us and when is relative to Valley View? Can you touch on that just briefly?
I'll have Brandy bring up the drawing. Just bring up the council back there. Okay. So this is
It's split into four.
it's split into 4 pages, but this is 14th Avenue. The fire, the water tower is right next door to this. There's the northern tier. This is that 7 acres that's not in the subdivision. That's water tower sits right here on this lot. And then this is the other portion of the northern tier.
Where Second Street is there.
Essentially, it's going to go up to about here straight across.
You can turn on the preliminary plan later.
Was it? Okay, I'll let you do that. So she's going to turn on the preliminary plan and it shows the phases. But as far as timeline goes, I'm working on the development agreement. I would have ideally had that plat before you tonight, but there were too many loose ends to pull together to get it done concisely enough to comfortably bring it to you. So I'm hoping that I'm there in 2 weeks' time for the first meeting in September, and that's what we're going to strive to bring it to you at that point.
No.
Yeah, it's not pulling up. Yeah, I was going to say, I think we're having technical difficulties.
Now, there were still potentially some issues to work out between the developer and the adjoining property owner, correct, on that?
Well, the attempt is still that the two find consensus. I don't know that they will. Our ordinances do not dictate that the downstream landowner have. He's asking for piping or something across his property. Our ordinances meter say that we can release water at the prehistoric rate in its existing locations. Now the developer and the landowner downstream have been working together on an agreement on how to route the water through the downstream property. I thought they were pretty darn close to that, and at the Plan Commission meeting I did strive or stress that I would hope that they would strive to perfect that before we bring it to the council. So we'll be checking in on that process and see where they're at. But again, our ordinances kind of stop at a certain point, and then it becomes a matter of the county does not have a rule that dictates what we do with the water once it leaves the city and enters the county, and that's kind of a something that the downstream landowner was counting on, but I don't know that they have that support from the county system either. But anyway, hopefully in 2 weeks we'll have something better to present to you.
Shane, just a question. On the south side and on the west side, all of that land on that hill, going down toward the property, all of that is dug up now. I thought that was kind of that was going to be the reservoir there to slow that water down, but that's all black dirt now on both sides.
The developer has taken down trees and did some sod busting, and that's about it. They haven't graded anything yet. They
No, I
haven't
know it
started
isn't.
building
I just
ponds,
thought
but
that grass was going to be the catch to slow it down.
there's still a fair amount of grass down the hill. I don't think he busted it all the way to the property line, but
Their SWIP probably has, their stormwater pollution prevention plan probably has some mechanisms in place to slow the water down. It's supposed to. So before we get too off track, I want to summarize for 2nd Street the assessments for, or in summary of what Shane should capture in the development agreement for the plat, is that there will be a linear foot charge for the street improvements based on the 51 and change dollars per foot. There will be a sewer cost. Those will be added together, and a consumer price index will be added to that for inflation, and they'll pay that before the plat's recorded. Is everyone more or less in agreement with that? Okay, so you can write that up, Shane. Anybody have any more questions about 2nd Street or Valley View before we move on? Okay, I'd like to move on to the R&Z edition public road dedication. And Shane was going to talk about that one as well.
Mike, you want to come up and help with this one?
I can probably give a summary of what we're talking about. Shane, if you want to bring the R&Z edition up on the GIS. 13th Avenue Southeast was constructed, I don't know the year, probably at least 10 years ago or more. From 14th Street east to the west, ending in a cul-de-sac. And that was intended to be a private road, and it was platted as a private road. It's labeled as a private road. About 2007 or 8, the developer asked the city to take that road over as a public road, and they were required to pave it, which they did. And so the road has now been paved. In order for that to be a standard city street, it would have had to be built in accordance with our ordinance requirements, including the sewer requirements. The road was built more or less to the city standards. The sewer was not. And there are still some outstanding sewer issues. There's a pipe in the ground and services. Those are all fine. There's a lift station which still has punch list items from long ago that haven't been satisfied. So now the owner has come to us again. We never did reach an agreement to take that road over. And he's asked again, will we take it over? And he's requested that we relieve some of the requirements that were put upon them a few years ago, which included do a chip seal on the road and the sewer improvements. They're willing to do all of the sewer improvements that we would require, but they're asking that the city do the chip seal, because if we had taken that road over at the time when we told them they had to pave it, we wouldn't have required a chip seal. But we've been working on this for 10 years, and now it's time to chip seal it. So
What is their reasoning for us or for them wanting us to take it over?
well, the way that it was platted, and if you could bring that plat back up. A private road is supposed to have property ownership going to the center line of the private street. That's not how this was platted. This has right-of-way, which is conceivably owned by the proprietor forever. It's got a road on it, that right-of-way. But even if you zoom into that, it says private roadway on there. And that will always and forever be owned by one person. And so they'll be responsible to maintain that. If that had been platted properly, the ownership lines would extend to the center line of the road, and every property owner would have a little piece of the road and would have a little piece of the responsibility. But the way this was platted puts it all on one person, and they have no way of sharing the cost for maintenance of that road or of the sewer or any of the rest of it. So for us, it's like any other road. It's built in a similar way. It is to our standard as far as I'm concerned. The sewer part isn't done yet, so that isn't to our standard. So the property owner's asking us to take over the road, and he'll do this. He'll bring the sewer stuff up to standard. And then there's more to the story, but that much of it, does everybody understand?
What happens, is the sewer completely outside of the road area?
I'll dive in with some different detail. So let's finish road discussion first. This portion of the roadway was, I'll say, recently vacated within the last few years. And they were supposed to rededicate a right-of-way or easement somehow to get back up to the provided outlet at some point. If you look at this turnaround that they constructed, portions of that also are not within whatever right-of-way that they provided us if we take it over. So there's going to have to be a access easement or a dedication of some sorts here on this north end of the turnaround, and maybe a slight portion down here on the south turnaround. So that's the road things. Storm sewer, there really isn't any storm sewer in here. This roadway has a spillway down here on the west end that spills into the Roby Creek drainage plain. As far as I know, there aren't any major issues with regard to drainage that I'm aware of. The lift station sits approximately where I put the hand here, and was built completely not to city standards. The wastewater folks have put together a large list of improvements that would need to be done to that. It includes, it only has a single pump. It needs to have duplex pumps. The pumps are single phase. They should be 3-phase. The electrical control box, because it only had one pump in it, would need to be redone such that it could accommodate the controls for 2 pumps, and also would need SCADA communications systems that could communicate with the wastewater plant. The wet well is probably undersized because of the single pump in there as well, so that might need to be upgrades. The wet well has a long list of deficiencies. No locks on the doorways, no check pit, no check valves on the force main, no closure valve on the force main, no base elbows, no piping in the wet well, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of things with the wet well that would need to be improved to bring that up to standards. Then one of the other main concerns is that the force main is rather shallow and discharges into a shallow manhole, and there's freezing concerns with that because of the flow in this area isn't very substantial, so the pump doesn't pump very often, and so that would be a concern as well. As far as the wastewater plant could tell, that they've never televised the sanitary sewer mains in this development, and we'd probably want to have an opportunity to jet and televise that also before we did anything as far as taking it over. So there's a fairly long list of wastewater issues, and we haven't done a detailed cost estimate what it would cost to do all this work. However, I'll just throw out a lump sum that's not substantiated by anything, but other than what our gut instinct on current costs for lift stations are. Lift stations are quite widely variable in price, but a typical lift station is in the range of 100,000 to 150,000, depending on the size, location, and the flows that it's expected. Now, this is a relatively small area, so we aren't talking about a massive lift station. So we're probably on the shorter dollar end than a larger structure, because it's not real deep. It's not overly big. The pumps don't have to pump thousands of gallons of water. They just have to pump hundreds of gallons of water at a time. So, but what we would do is probably engage a pump manufacturer. Well, we have a local company. They can give us an idea what the pumps would cost, what the control panels would cost, etc., and then have to go from there on the structural side of things. But the question is, we know what the deficiencies are. We need to write a path that takes them from private hands and puts them in public hands, and how do we want to do that, and who's going to pay for what cost to do so. So as mentioned, I mean, we're talking primarily about dedication of some right-of-way or some easements, access easements. We're talking about potentially seal coating or doing some minor street work, which that in and of itself isn't real expensive. I don't think we're talking about a huge dollar figure there, and the lift station is by far the most encumbersome portion of this project.
One thing, if I could note, the mayor pointed out, which I think is important, is that this private road did not have a maintenance agreement. This road was platted along with the development back in 1995, and since 2011 we have an ordinance, the requirement that any platted private roadway, drive, what have you, has to have a maintenance agreement so that an issue like this doesn't creep up again.
What that means, no one lives forever. Eventually, the person who owns that right-of-way right now won't be on earth anymore. Who will be responsible? It's unclear. So I think this is a good time to clean it up, and it isn't the way we'd like to do it, but I think to clean it up, there is some benefit to us in the future. But what would you see as the requirements on the developer for us to be willing to take the road over? That's the question we're asking today.
So they're willing to take care of all of the deficiencies on the sewer and all that. We would take over the road. That's pretty much what I'm taking out of that, correct?
Well, ultimately, when the sewer is brought up to code or to our standards, we would take over the sewer and the lift station maintenance as well.
Right, but they'd put the money out to get it up to standard?
If that's what you're suggesting. I mean, the property owner had a meeting with the city and apparently didn't get a detailed list of what the deficiencies were, left the meeting with remembering what the requirements were going to be, and has offered, and I'll read this to you. We understand the lift station needs to have a redundant pump and a SCADA system installed to meet city standards. We consider installing the redundant pump to be our responsibility, and should the city decide to take over the street, we will install the pump and the SCADA system. So they're not looking at this big long punch list. They're looking at a couple things on it, and some of those things are more expensive than others. But ultimately, it's up to the council whether or not we would accept this offer, and for you to define the terms upon which we would accept the street.
What was the expectation, or what were they supposed to have done and when? Because, I mean, this was a requirement of theirs going way back, right? I mean, it sounds like something that did not get done or did not get maintained.
Well, sort of. They platted it as a private road, and so they didn't meet our standards. They didn't have to. But it was about 2007, I think, when they first asked the city to take it over. And at that time, that's when they were told they had to pave it and bring the sewer up to standard. And they paved it, but the sewer was not brought up to standard.
But I mean, it should have been at that point, right?
It should have been, yes.
If they were going to choose to turn it over to the city. If they didn't do both, then they paved it on their own with no expectation because they didn't do the second. But if they is there going to be any major sewer work that's going to rip up the road?
At this time, I'm going to say no.
Okay.
But we haven't televised it, so we need to at least look at
Right.
that first before we would make that final determination. One of the things, and I'm just going to read between the lines here, again, what we would try to do is reach out and work with these folks through a development agreement or some type of subsequent agreement that sets the path for us to take it over. And one of the requests I think we're hearing is that the folks that subsequently have owned the properties along there probably are willing to work with the city on a way to get this done. I'm presuming that they may want to entertain a assessment procedure of somehow where they can do the improvements, pay for them over a period of time. And if that's the case, then that probably means the city puts, either we put the money up front or they put the money up front and then decide how they're going to pay for it amongst themselves. But that some type of agreement to move this from private hands to public hands is what needs to be done.
Here's my concern. I'm good with the chip seal if that's what's required. If we'd have done it 10 years ago, we'd be doing that now anyway. What really concerns me, and I've seen it before, is and I'm going to say with good intentions, developers go out and they don't want, let's use this one for example. I'm going to do it so that it's a private road. I'm not going to have a public road. Then there comes a time when I don't want the private road anymore. And there's somewhat of an expectation that I'm going to give this to you, Mr. and Mrs. City, and we have to foot the bill. So it actually, by taking an action and saying that they shouldn't pay for all of the sewer part of it or anything else other than the chip seal, is really rewarding them for poor behavior, so to speak, if it's a child or a dog, right?
Well,
I don't think that we can do that. I think they have to bring it up to standards, whatever that is defined as, at their costs. I'm good with the chip seal, but that's the only time that we would take it over as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, so we would put that detailed list in order, and Mike, you can help us do that, and figure out an expected cost for that, and then that leads us to the next part of this discussion, which would be how is that accomplished? Because the property owner doesn't have an easy way to collect the money to do the sewer improvements. We have a process of assessment where it's put on the taxes of the property owners. So if they would bring forward a petition of all the property owners in that subdivision which are benefiting from the sewer improvements, who would all agree to pay their pro rata share of the sewer improvements, whatever they might be, then we are protected. The project would go forward. The city would have to pay it up front if we did an assessment project, because that's how assessment projects work. But then we'd have assurance through taxes that the money would be collected to reimburse us. And there is an interest element in that. And it's been historically 10%, except for the 4% one that we did recently. So that's another option. But we can't do an assessment project on a private road. We would have to take the road over, and we could write the development agreement such that there must be a successful assessment project, or the road automatically goes back to private status without any further action on the part of the council by such a certain date. If that, I mean, that's one way we could do that.
Well, I think they got to get the approval from their landowners there too, that are willing to put out that money. I mean, otherwise, it's a waste of their time, our time.
Right.
So they need to make sure that they know exact costs or close to it, and then say, all right, we need to have 95%. Or it looks, I was looking up as to who the owners are. There's about 8 different owners in that group out there on that street.
Yeah, so maybe it's $20,000 a piece.
Yeah,
That's a big chunk of change, but
Yeah.
they'd have 10 years to pay it by a standard assessment process. And if they're all in favor of petitioning an assessment project, and we have an agreement in writing from all of those folks to carry through on those obligations, or it goes back to private status, then I think we're adequately protected. But we don't want to, this is kind of, we don't want to do a bunch of work if you aren't in favor of that.
There's a number of these things that we've done. We've done them in alleyways, and we've done a number of different assessments. How do we know how much city money, we're serving as the bank, I mean, we really are. How much money do we have that we can allocate to this type of improvements to go back through the assessment process?
This would be like any other type of assessment project that we do. We don't normally budget for them because we don't know if we're going to have them. So they come out of existing unallocated fund balance. In this case, if it's sewer work, it would come out of the sewer fund. And it would be funded, and then throughout the 10 years, any revenue, including the interest, would go back to the sewer fund. So it would be basically the sewer fund's unallocated fund balance at the time we did the project.
And so, obviously, if that's the direction we go, those funds are available, or are they not?
Depending on what the cost is. I mean, the sewer fund has a healthy fund balance that's sitting there, but there are also some big projects that they have planned. So you'd want to make sure that that's in the best interest of the sewer department and what that final cost is.
You guys would need to make a recommendation to us whether that can occur or not, and put you into jeopardy in any other manner then, right? Of any other projects or capital needs, correct?
I guess so.
Correct.
sounds like we'd have to get some bids as to what it's going to cost, and then make the decision once the costs are sort of factored out. I mean, obviously there's going to be some unknown anytime you tear into existing.
Yeah.
Correct, Mike? I
Yeah.
mean, do you have any issues other than that? I mean, other than the deficiencies in that project?
Well, I think some of the stuff is, I'm not so sure we wouldn't lose part of the street because I think the force main is so shallow that it freezes. And I don't know if that can be saved. I think it's maybe as shallow as 4.5 feet from the surface when it drops into a gravity manhole. We've seen frost get down to 7 foot. So if you had to retrench a new force main and a deeper one, it could get very expensive. And one of the biggest drawbacks of that lift station is that it doesn't have a check valve pit. So if you're working in this situation, you've sent a guy down in the wet well, he's hanging on a cable, and your valves and nuts and bolts are down in there, corroded, rusted. You really have to get some leverage, but you're dangling from a cable. So normally we put a second dry pit beside the wet well to provide a safe and more functional workspace for check valves and isolation valves and nuts and bolts. Move that out of that wet well and to where you can get some leverage and you can be standing on solid ground when you're doing the wrenching and so forth. So I think this could be a very, very expensive project.
So
Well,
I think
if they had to bury that, had to dig up the existing 4.5 foot line, whatever it is, and go deeper with that, and that took part of the road, to me, that's not the road cost, that's the sewer cost. So to replace the road is part of the sewer project. Would that be correct?
At this point, it would be because
Yeah.
they're both there.
Yep. Okay.
So we're going to have to do some research as to if it's just some minor things that can be fixed or if it's some major things that need to be fixed.
And I don't know, maybe Shane knows, but I don't know where the closest place to get to a public sewer that's deeper is. It might be 3 times as long. I don't know.
Right. We probably, this would be, a lift station's typically a project that we would hand off to a consultant potentially too. So there's definitely some work that needs to be done, but direction as to how we get that work accomplished is what this work session was intended for tonight, and I think the mayor can summarize where I feel like I'm at, but that's what this was about, was to give you guys information, what this request is, how it impacts both them privately and the city going forward, and just discuss and pave the path to bringing this from the private sector into the public sector. And all of this discussion is very valid and needs to be proved out through our process.
Thinking off the top of my head, always a dangerous place for me to be, but there I am. If you wanted to contemplate, depending on cost, if it's going to get costly and you want to keep moving with it, if you want to do a special assessment project, you can always substitute. You always have $325,000 that gets budgeted each year for a sewer project, either rehab or reconstruction. If you wanted to go through this process, you could use that, and that could be your project for that year. It's its own line item. It would be its own project, and you could assess that back versus trying to come up with an unallocated fund balance. So, I mean, it's something that we already have anticipated. It's already there, and we do that every year. So, I mean, so you don't have to worry about whether there's unallocated fund balance on a year you're doing a bigger project whenever this would come to fruition. That's another thought. You can, think that over, but it would be easier than looking and going back and redoing a cash flow.
I guess I'm not in, I mean, I hear what you're saying, Shelley, but I'm not in favor of, until we've got a plan in place and a mechanism to pay for it, I'm not in favor of looking at taking dollars that could have been used for a different project to apply to this. I mean, I feel too that this is something that should have been taken care of, and if they want to turn it to the city, that's going to be their responsibility to pay for it or have a mechanism to pay for it.
Right, but if you guys want to go through the special assessment process and it's a bigger project, if you did not want to contemplate using unallocated fund balance and having, I mean, it's one of those things where that's budgeted each year. If you would want to take that would be up to you guys. Or if you don't want to go through the special assessment project and use any city dollars, you can state that, and it would be completely up to them to come up with the dollars up front. I mean, the special assessment project is just, it's basically a loan to a developer. And it's city dollars that's being used.
But aren't we potentially delaying another project that would have been budgeted though by going the route that you're suggesting, Shelley?
Potentially, yes, depending on the cost. I mean, because like for instance, this year you did a project that only used about half of what that money was budgeted for. So I guess I'm just saying there is that line item with dollars available. If you didn't want to have to go back through and redo a cash flow and make sure that there's unallocated fund balance, or wait or prolong it or, whatever. I mean, there is that line item there, or you could just not use any of those dollars at all.
We have options. I don't think we need to know all the details right now. What we do need to know is if the council would be in favor of pursuing this type of arrangement where the city would take over the street on certain conditions, that the sewer improvements be brought up to city standard, and we'll work out the development agreement that would have to come back to you anyway for action. But for right now, this would help Shane figure out what to say in the proposed development agreement and tell the property owner what's expected of them.
Yeah, I mean, today, I don't care how it's paid back. Today is, I am for the city taking it over under the conditions that you just mentioned. Now it's going to be up to somebody to figure out what those things are and what the costs are. And if the current owner chooses that's what they want to pursue, then we can look at options based on the because it's certainly going to be, the total amount of the project is going to dictate to some extent what we do. So I think at that point, if it's going to go forward, they bring it back and we can look at options then. But it doesn't do us any good to talk about them tonight because we don't know what we're talking about. So as far as dollars go.
Shelley, I do have one question with regard to assessments. We've changed the rate of interest, but have we ever changed the term? As typical limit is 10 years. Have we ever done a 15 or beyond?
No, 10 years has always been the max, and I guess I wouldn't encourage a longer term. It just makes it more of a longer term loan.
Let me ask a question. The current owner, is that then a lot of record as it is? Is that a lot of record?
Well, that's
It's taxable,
one of
or-
our concerns is that somehow he's going to have to describe the unpurchased portion of this, i.e. the right-of-way, or what will become right-of-way, and deed it over to the city. And
Right.
Probably somebody's paying taxes on that land today.
No, I bet they're not. I bet the way this is platted is confusing enough that the county thinks it's public right of way.
Yeah. The-
And it isn't being taxed.
Yeah, the confusion is in the certifications to that plat. The certifications read as if what's being dedicated is all public right-of-way. So any rights-of-way, any roads that could have conceivably been dedicated on that plat, according to the certifications, are public. The problem with that is that whole document, the plat, map, if you will, and the certifications are all viewed as one contract. And so what you look at in canons of contract construction is if you have two conflicting provisions, which most clearly indicates the intent of the parties. The certification language that talks about the public right of way, all rights of way being dedicated to the public, is boilerplate. The plat, however, depicts in written terms what exactly that parcel, that road parcel, is supposed to be dedicated as private right-of-way. So if I would jump out on a limb a bit, but should this ever be brought forth in a court of law, I would think that the plat designation would trump the certification. But there's enough there to make it confusing for the county's assessors.
Well, it's very confusing because what area are they assessing tax on? That has no legal description other than private roadway. And Shane, if you bring up the GIS and click on it with the eye to see if it has a dot, they're not taxing it. If it comes up as a lot, somebody might be paying taxes on it. But I'm going to venture to say it comes up as a dot.
Yeah, correct.
The county thinks it's right of way, and it's not being taxed. So
Have we looked at any of the purchase agreements on those lots that were sold to see if there's any language in there about responsibility?
I've
Because
not
if
looked at
they
it.
have to, don't they have to know whether this is a public or a private road?
Should.
I mean, they shouldn't be
I mean,
calling
that's
the
what-
mayor with a pothole, they'd be calling the owner, right?
Well, theoretically.
Right.
But, I mean, the assessor is receiving this document to record, and it looks like a road. And he clicks on the GIS. This is the county's geographic
It's blank.
information. It comes up as the same as right-of-way. So it's probably not being taxed. It should be. But the way that it was drawn on the plat itself was confusing, so they're confused. Anyway, the fact of the matter is we have an opportunity to clear this up, and I think you have probably enough information, Shane, to draft an agreement. We need to keep moving. So thank you for that. The next item is discussion of proposed U.S. Highway 212 changes, and this discussion is in an effort to give the State Department of Transportation the assurance they need to move forward with their design of U.S. Highway 212. They want to know what we want. What are we asking for when it comes to U.S. Highway 212 so they can design it appropriately. But they want it in writing, like in resolution form. And that's not what you're receiving tonight. Tonight's just discussion, but you're probably going to see a letter, you authorizing me to sign a letter or a resolution by the council for action on several road items on Highway 212. 11th Street intersection, 11th Street East. We've asked them to look at making that a through road. That's a very different design than if it's not a through road to the south. What do we want to do there? Where the traffic signal is in the entrance to the mall is south of the traffic signal is not public right-of-way. It's a private driveway, and that's not the normal place for a signal. Would we consider moving that to a public road intersection? And we probably would. The nearest one is 14th Street, which goes north and south, but it needs some realignment. So if we're going to ask them to do that, they got work to do with right-of-way and such. So that's another question. And the third item is 17th Street, which is going to take a lot of traffic. That leads to the soccer fields and the new softball complex. And that comes to a T. And it's not a good place for an intersection. 19th Street has a signal, so we might want to realign 17th to line up with the signal at 19th Street, which would also involve some modification to their design. So those are the elements. The DOT would like the city to say what we want in writing somehow. So we want to know what you think.
I like all three of those suggestions.
Okay.
I think those all have a lot of value and a lot of merit. I suppose we shouldn't ask them to turn it into a one-way at this point anyway.
No.
I think those are we've talked about those a number of times. I think every one of those has a lot of value in trying to manage our traffic. And it helps us with the mall property as well, because the 14th is on the east side of the mall, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And 14th Street also leads to the softball complex.
Right. And that's where it's important that we get some offload, you know, especially, I think that might change a little bit if we were able to divert 17th over to 19th.
Yes.
Okay, it might change a little bit, but both of them would be advantageous to us, I believe.
Yes. Okay, is that enough information, Shane, for the DOT?
I believe so. I'll draft a letter to the DOT and have
And
you-
request authorization for the
Yep.
mayor to sign the letter. So that'll be on a
Yep.
future council meeting.
Can that be a consent agenda item? Can the authorization to sign a letter be on the consent agenda or not? Okay.
I have a question. Who's in charge of acquiring those easements, and DOT is then?
No, probably the city. I mean, it would, if anything outside of the Highway 212 right-of-way would probably fall on the city.
Yeah.
So
What-
if we have to potentially purchase
Right.
land that,
But, and this is years down the road, but right now they're doing the design phase. And it might require extra DOT right-of-way as well. So they will need to pursue that.
Right.
There's a
So
lot that has to be done in order for these things to happen.
we're kind of at step 1 or 2. After they receive this, then subsequently, whatever we decide to agree to going forward, they will engage us in a agreement that we would have to pass by resolution and go forward, because they will not work with us continuously without a commitment from the city on payment and the design as well. So,
Shane, what's the schedule again on Highway 212?
okay, first schedule is 2019. That encompasses Highway 212 from Highway 20 to Highway 81. Then Phase 2 is from Highway 81 to 19th Avenue
Street.
or 19th Street, excuse me, over by Runnings and the cemetery, and that is scheduled for 2021.
Now, the western portion, they're going to take that bridge, so that'll be closed, correct?
The bridge will be removed and replaced, yes.
So that'll be an all-summer
Yep.
project. And then the western or the east portion, are they going to do a couple blocks at a time, kind of like how they did North Highway 81?
Remains to be seen. But I do know that we've expressed to them that however they approach either of these projects, that they recognize that some properties are completely landlocked. For instance, the properties to the south of Highway 212 and west of Broadway are completely isolated, as well are some of them immediately to the east there as well. So they'll have to stage that such that they accommodate as much traffic to those people as can be, and that might be a very cumbersome access for at times. I fully expect that it'll be a lot of complaining and grumbling during that project.
Shane, have there been discussions ongoing with property owners along 212?
The DOT has done a very good job of engaging all of the property owners along 212. They know what they're being asked to they're taking isn't the correct word, purchasing additional right-of-way to accommodate the sidewalk along there. So their right-of-way people have been engaged in this project for quite a few years actually already. And so they're lining it all up so that the design team can complete their design, and the state will be purchasing and working with all of the landowners along the project.
Shane, are they going to be cutting down on cuts into the highway also, like for property owners that have two? Or
There'll probably be a few isolated driveways that get either shortened or eliminated. I can't speak to any of them that I know of for sure because I haven't seen any final designs by any means. But I anticipate that there'll be some driveways that will be adjusted.
Shane, I know we don't have any say in the methodology of how they do this, but we have a lot of businesses on 212 that are going to be greatly impacted by this, and I think that's going to be a very significant financial impact. It would be wonderful if they could maintain an east-west flow on there while they worked on the south half of the road and then came back and did the north half of the road for those properties. That's going to be a huge impact for those businesses. So
I can assure you that discussion has been had, and I believe that that's the way they're heading with their project management. But I can't speak for the DOT. But we've at least expressed that concern, and they've had those conversations. And all the truck traffic will likely be detoured on the bypass because once the bridge is gone, it's gone for the duration of the project and won't come back until the end.
Shane or Mayor, I mean, you threw out 3 suggestions, which we've just talked about before, and I fully support as well. Is there something else? I mean, I got an email from Don Roby on the DOT board, obviously, just the other day. He said plans on the Highway 212 reconstruction are well underway. So I guess I'm asking, is there something else before it's too late that we want to look at along here while we've got the chance? Because it sounds like the window of opportunity is closing real fast here.
We've and with the great assistance from the wastewater department, we have actually televised all of our sanitary sewer lines, all of our storm sewer lines that the city's directly responsible for along the stretch, and have evaluated them and found no significant issues that we would need to take care of along with their project. So from an infrastructure standpoint, we're in pretty good shape. On a staff level, though, the engineering department is working with the DOT to try to alleviate some of the drainage issues that we see periodically on Highway 212. For instance, I mean, a couple of years ago we had the infamous photo of the people kayaking in the pawn shop parking lot by 6th and Highway 212. And then we've seen other media postings where you can see water inundating portions of 212. So just to give you a quick summary, we are looking at the area between Highway 81 and Roby Creek. We're trying to accommodate either a portion of Highway 212 being rerouted to Roby Creek and emptying there, or planning for a future drainage way to the south through the Shopko area on the way to the Big Sioux River as well. So we're working with the DOT to identify the best routes for some of that storm flow at this time.
I'd like to keep moving along if we
Yeah,
could.
thank you.
We can talk about that more, and I'm sure there'll be some public meetings. But you have direction on moving forward with that. Okay, we're going to skip item 5, update on storm shelter project, due to lack of time here, and move on to discussion of ordinance 1736, amending section 7.0806 and striking section 18.0108 to clarify the authority of the street superintendent. I'll let Justin lead this.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be very quick here. The majority of this ordinance is clerical housekeeping, if you will. 180108 is a substantive copy of 7.0806, and the thought is there's no need to have it doubled up. So the thought was to eliminate 180108, leave 7.0806. The revisions to 7.0806 reflect the fact that this ordinance, as it reads currently, is what was passed in October of 1889 by the City Council of Watertown. It has not changed since then, and the thought is it may be time to ensure that the responsibilities of the street superintendent keep up with the times.
Thank you. Any discussion about that or questions?
Yeah,
Okay.
it was, if I could add real quick, it's
sure.
ordinance number 43. That was the 43rd ordinance passed by the City Council of Watertown in its history.
We don't number them anymore. The numbers got big. Now we give them a year. Okay, item number 7 is discussion on ordinance 17-40, amending section 18.01013 of the revised ordinance of the City of Watertown to prohibit the parking of boats, jet skis, and campers/RVs on residential streets. Justin?
Thank you, Mayor. Given the short time frame, this is likely going to be a jumping off point to maybe a future discussion. But the thought here you might recall here a few months back, there was a provision in section 216501 in our zoning ordinances that related to storage and parking on lots, on premise. And there was a provision within that ordinance that related to on-street parking. And the thought was, well, that's more of a police power concern as opposed to a zoning concern. So that provision should substantially be moved to the police power parking provision, which is found in 180101. Subpart 3 appeared to be the best place to house that provision. In making the transition, however, law enforcement had contacted my office after the fact and had noted that the original genesis of the provision 216501 sub 10, I believe it was, the original on-premise parking provision in zoning law, had a number of purposes behind it that may not have made it into this latest iteration. Specifically, the fact that the council was concerned about issues of watercraft trailers, your jet skis, your boat trailers being parked on streets, also campers and RVs. The way that the language currently reads right now is it wouldn't capture all watercraft trailers or campers and RVs, and the thought was then to insert that language in there to be more explicit. Captain McMahon is kind enough to join us here to provide some additional context, maybe some additional thoughts on potential language.
Sure, thank you, Justin. I think Justin covered it pretty well. From the police department's point of view, there are a couple language items that we'd like to see clarified or inserted. One is the over 1 ton vehicle. We believe that should be a vehicle that has a capacity of carrying more than 1 ton, because most cars are probably over 1 ton. Then the other deal was the trailer, from making it from a watercraft trailer to essentially any trailer that's parked on a street. That's something that we oftentimes get complaints about. So just a couple of language clarification items there. And then lastly, to have an ordinance that is easy for the public to understand and adhere to, as well as secondly, an ordinance that's rather easy for us to enforce. So an ordinance that isn't vague, that's pretty clear to the point, is something that we'd be looking for.
And just to clarify, Captain, would the police be averse to having an exception for contractor trailers?
I believe there is an exception somewhere in the ordinances for overnight.
There is for a separate
yes.
provision, but
Right.
would it be okay to also include that language
Sure.
here? Okay,
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
I would just like to add my concern that if this is something that we would not be intending to enforce all the time. We'd only enforce it on a complaint basis, or if someone's really doing it all the time. That bothers me a little bit, to have something that we're passing a rule that we may not be actually enforcing all the time. But there will be a public hearing on this
Right.
change in the future, at a future meeting, so people will be able to weigh in on that.
Right.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Okay, then I think we'll go ahead and adjourn and take a quick 5-minute break before the full council meeting. Thank you. Oh.